Have you ever been tempted to try CBD? Maybe you've heard how it helps with sleep, or pain, or depression, but what do we actually know?
There's data on CBD as an anti-anxiety. CBD at the right dose can be an antipsychotic.
Just like most other herbal medicines, CBD is understudied, unregulated, and often wrongly vilified.
All the years it's been locked away, all the years of the stigma, the policy and political elements of all of this have really hampered science for so long.
But Jeff Chen has a new approach to unlock its secrets.
The folks who were using the CBD products saw kind of dramatic improvements in as little as the effects were kicking in within a week.
And the secrets of the entire cannabis plant, like new players CBN.
It's beating placebo for sleep quality improvements in people who have disturbed sleep, and looks to be as good, if not maybe even better, than melatonin.
Stick around for the new science of CBD and how to use it.
So if you're someone who is trying to figure out how to use a CBD product, the first thing I might say is,
I'm Dr. Karan, an NHS surgeon, and this is Dr. Karan Explores, a podcast where we cut through the BS of modern health advice and tackle the biggest issues in science, health, and medicine. Have you ever seen a bottle of CBD pills and wondered whether it's worth the price tag? CBD might be showing promise in treating a range of health outcomes, but there's still a massive lack of good science on its effects. And the stuff you pick up from the health shop, there's a good chance that it doesn't even contain the amount of CBD promised on the label. So what do we know? How does CBD and other cannabis compounds affect our health? And how can we be as informed as possible as consumers? Jeff Chen co-founded Radicle Science to shed light on the effects of natural medicines. Through completely remote, crowd-sourced clinical trials, he and his team are doing tons of research advancing our understanding of CBD and other herbal remedies. Well, Jeff, it's great to have you back on. I'm really interested about CBD, cannabidiol. Just tell me a little bit more, and to the average person who doesn't really know what CBD is and who might think that CBD is cannabis, and what is the difference between CBD and, what component is it of cannabis and what else is there?
Yeah, so, even just the term cannabis is referring to just this species of plant, which colloquially in the past was called marijuana. It was called a lot of things. It's also kind of synonymous with what we colloquially call hemp. But cannabis is the kind of official scientific name of this plant. And the cannabis plant produces a lot of different compounds, and they're not really found anywhere else in the naturally occurring world. And so we name these compounds cannabinoids, which are cannabis-like things. And so we named it after the cannabis plant. So CBD is one cannabinoid. But at this point, we've discovered over 100 cannabinoids. And another cannabinoid that many folks may be familiar with is THC. And THC is responsible for the intoxicating effects of cannabis, as well as some of the kind of dependency effects of cannabis. But THC has its own medical value as well. CBD is another cannabinoid. It has no intoxicating effects. It has no addictive or dependency potential. And we're still trying to understand more and more what are its health effects and what are its medical applications.
Now, when I was speaking to Professor David Nutt, who's a well-known neuropharmacologist, certainly in the UK, and he was involved on a governmental level in trying to improve understanding and usage of drugs which could have a potential medical benefit, things like LSD and psilocybin. And he mentioned, and I suspect this might be similar to CBD and other active agents which are in the marijuana plants, there was a few decades from the 50s and 60s where basically there was almost no research. And at what point do you think we were starting to research cannabis, CBD, THC in huge volume, and then it seemed to have almost become quackery and pseudoscience for a number of years, and now there seems to be a reemergence of that research with an increased intensity? At what point in our history of humans do you think this kind of naturalistic tendency to look at these natural herbs and substances, including things like mushrooms, but CBD specifically, at what point did it fall off the wagon and be thrown and bundled into the pseudoscience quackery wagon?
It's a great question. So, the cannabis and all of the compounds that can be found in cannabis were largely made illegal starting in, at least in the US, but also in much of the world, starting in about the 30s and 40s. And Prior to that, you could purchase cannabis at herbal shops, and doctors actually prescribed it. It was part of the U.S. pharmacopoeia. And I know throughout Europe, in many pharmacopoeias as well, it was a kind of a mainstay herbal medicine. And starting in the 30s and 40s, it was restricted and increasingly restricted. And all the way, at least again, in the US, all the way into the 70s is when it was placed as a controlled substance officially. But even prior to that, there wasn't much research at all being done anywhere in the world, honestly. And from the 70s on and onwards, as it was now labeled a controlled substance and lumped together with other drugs, very dangerous drugs, heroin, things like that, that's when they started researching cannabis for its addictive potential. So it was a lot of substance abuse research, understanding, here are the doses that it may or may not kill you. Here's things that it does to the brain. But this whole time, all the research was still really focused on THC. People barely knew what CBD was. It had been isolated and identified, but then kind of just like put away. No one really cared about it. And it wasn't really until, say, in the last decade that because of popular interest in CBD started emerging, that then the research community started being like, this is something that we should look at. But I'm sure as we'll get into on this podcast, there's many reasons why that research hasn't fully happened the way that we'd want it to. And we still don't understand a lot about CBD.
And you mentioned there that there was a lot of interest and hype initially in the cannabinoid, which we know is THC, tetrahydrocannabinol. You also mentioned before that it had its own medical uses as well. I mean, that's certainly not my area of expertise, but what specific medical uses has evidence base for THC specifically?
So what's really paradoxical is cannabis as a plant, as well as THC that came from this cannabis plant, this was a drug, a narcotic, and a lot of people got in trouble and a lot of people went to jail for it. And it messed up a lot of people's lives and communities. Paradoxically, in the 1980s, there was an FDA-approved synthetic version of THC. And it was approved for various indications, including vomiting from chemotherapy and people who were losing too much weight from AIDS. And again, if you think about cannabis, it gives you appetite, it helps relieve nausea. So you had a pharmaceutical company and a synthetic version of THC being FDA approved, and doctors could prescribe it, again, in the US and eventually around the world. Other countries also allowed this medication. It was called Marinol. That was kind of the brand name of this medication. Yet THC from cannabis and the cannabis plant itself continued to be illegal. And even to this day in America, it's still a Schedule I drug. It's classified alongside heroin and all these other things. Now, other medical uses as well of THC that we're kind of having some emerging data on, there seems to be a good application for certain types of chronic pain. That's an area I think that could have a lot of potential. And outside of that, there are these kind of small little studies that show potential for THC with sleep disorders, that show potential for THC and things like Tourette's syndrome, the tics that you might have from Tourette's syndrome, and other forms of THC in combination with other cannabinoids for things like multiple sclerosis and some of the kind of muscle spasms that you have with that. And so it is a really interesting landscape to look at when you have these pharma preparations that are there, but we're still trying to figure out what happens with the herbal. And the herbal preparations are not pure. A lot of times there's so many other things in there. There's CBD mixed in there. There's a bunch of other things. So we're trying to disentangle the individual effects. It's difficult.
So now that there's a reemergence and growing body of research, and I guess a lot of that in the US certainly is driven in the US by the 2018 legislation, the Farmers Bill, where hemp could be produced and CBD could be extracted and synthesized from that, which obviously helped the research as well. And what's interesting is what you guys do in Radicle Science, where essentially you take crowd-based data, a large volume of data, and using that to determine outcomes. And it's a lot of volunteer and population-based epidemiology and self-reporting. What sort of evidence have you gleaned from your initial observations and studies with Radicle Science with regards to the effects of CBD, THC, and various other things?
There's a few kind of buckets here. So one study we ran, this is actually the first study we ran as a company back in, that must have been 2021. And what we did was, like you said, at that time, we just had thousands of people volunteered to be in the study, they were shipped a different CBD product. And then we compared them. The control group in that one study was not a placebo control group. It was a waitlist control. So you basically have people who said, I'd be interested in being in a CBD study, but they had to wait before they were sent a product. And that way, the entire sample that you had were all people who had an interest and intention to use CBD. So in that case, they were kind of comparable in that sense. One group received their different CBD products immediately it was 13 different manufacturers sending 13 different formulations of CBD. The other waitlist control sat there and waited, and then eventually they got their product. But while they waited, they became the control group. And what you saw is their anxiety, their pain, their sleep disturbances, et cetera, didn't really change. It improved slightly during that control period, just kind of a natural improvement. And then the folks who were using the CBD products saw kind of dramatic improvements in as little as the effects were kicking in within a week. And the entire study lasted, if I remember correctly, I think maybe 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks. And the improvements looked like they were still continuing all the way to the end of the study. Now, big caveat, because we didn't have that placebo control group, the results of that study need to be interpreted with a bit of caution. But what was really nice is we didn't really see any incidents of any serious side effects. And I know one of the reasons, at least in the US and as well as in the EU, in terms of what the FSA, they've been saying we need to understand better about some of the side effects of CBD. Now, speaking of side effects of CBD, I think there is data on very high dose pharmaceutical preparations of pure CBD that at very, very, very high doses have some concerning side effects. Again, I'm more sure we'll get into that here, but at least in our study, we didn't find that. Now, after that first pilot study we did as a company, Radicle, all our other studies became double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled. So really being able to know if a product is truly effective or if it's just the placebo effect. Now, since then, the data that we've released have actually been on preparations of CBD with other cannabinoids as well as with other herbal products. So it's really hard for us to say CBD by itself, what areas is it effective or is it just the placebo effect? But at least in combination with other things, we found that these formulations are, for instance, highly effective for sleep. And in particular, CBN, another cannabinoid that I think is going to be, it's already, getting a lot of popularity. There is we released some pretty promising data head to head. It's beating placebo for sleep quality improvements in people who have disturbed sleep, and looks to be as good, if not maybe even better than melatonin, which is like the most widely studied gold standard non-prescription sleep aid around the world.
And you've tested both CBN and melatonin head to head in a study yet?
Correct. Yes. It was a multi-arm study, placebo, melatonin, and then CBN. And what we found is that, again, it was superior to placebo. It was non-inferior to melatonin. That study wasn't fully powered to conclude if it was superior, but at least we know it's non-inferior to melatonin. So again, it's pretty interesting new findings.
And in this multi-arm study, what are the specific primary end outcomes that you study, which then say, okay, hang on, that is great. It shows us this or that?
Yeah. So in this case, this was using a validated sleep measure scale that was actually developed by the U.S. National Institutes of Health to run these kind of virtual studies. So we had thousands of people volunteer. We put them through screening. They had to have a certain level of severity of sleep disturbance. And then they were blinded and shipped either placebo or one of the active products, either melatonin or, CBN, et cetera. And then we collected data from them virtually. And it was, to date, it's by far the largest study ever done on cannabinoids, period.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was the first it was the first human study to actually understand if CBN could help sleep outcomes, because anecdotally, tons of people were talking about it, but there was never any hard data yet.
Wow. And obviously, a lot of the trial participants who sign up to be part of this have some vested interest in improving their quality of life, sleep, pain scores, etc., in some way or the other. So these are people who maybe have some degree of either amateur level background knowledge and reading about CBD and CBN and these various other things, and who may arguably have some degree of inherent bias going into that. How do you account for that inherent bias? Because these people are almost self-selecting themselves rather than you recruiting completely raw people who are naive to any knowledge about CBD.
Such a good question. Yeah. So in this case, our recruitment and advertising was largely just focused more on people who had sleep issues. So, hey, do you have sleep issues? Would you like to be in a natural products study? But inevitably, of the people who express interest, as they start learning more about the study and they see it's on a cannabinoid, obviously anyone who has a predilection or an interest or a belief about that is more likely to actually go all the way through and sign up and all of that. So you're right. They have a heightened expectancy bias, aka there may be a large placebo effect. That's why it's so important to have that placebo control group, to blind people to it, and really importantly, to randomize them. If I just took the first 1,000 people that signed up and I assigned them to the placebo, and the next wave of 1,000 I assigned to CBN, that data is not going to be comparable. Because let's say my ads on the first 1,000 people were hitting Super Bowl fans, whatever. And then my next round of ads were hitting retirement home dwellers in Florida or something. Those groups would not be comparable. So as each person expresses interest and they're eligible to study, they get randomized. Product, placebo. And the idea is that all of these so-called confounding variables, do they drink alcohol? Do they have other types of health areas? Are they vegan? Do they exercise? It kind of gets balanced out between the two groups. And therefore, any differences that emerge, it's not due to a genetic difference or a lifestyle difference. It's due to the one thing that was fundamentally different. This group got the active product. This group got the placebo. And that's why I started off by saying earlier that that first big study we did many, many years ago when we were just getting started as a company, those results need to be interpreted with some caution because, again, people knew exactly what they were getting. They were sent the CBD product. And yes, anyone opting in to that study at that point, they probably had an elevated belief and an elevated interest, which meant that benefit that we saw, a good chunk of that was probably the placebo effect. And it's hard to say how much of that benefit that we saw in that unblinded study was due to the placebo effect and then how much of it was due to the true effectiveness of that product.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the placebo effect there, and I agree. From what you've said, there may be some proportion of placebo effect, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing because we know historically throughout data that placebo effect, whether, something actually works or not, it still has some physiological improvement in patients. Now, given that you've done this kind of novel study where, you're sort of almost crowdsourcing the data in a way and taking this self-reported data, which has some good outcomes, how widely accepted is that in the CBD research community, the way the methodology you use to conduct these studies?
Yeah, so the studies, especially the ones that we've done since that pilot where we moved to fully double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled, it's all of the academic gold standard ways to conduct a trial. And so these are results that we publish in peer-reviewed journals, and we have collaborators that come into our studies. We haven't, unfortunately, collaborated with anyone from the UK. It's actually could be a reminder to reach out. There's some really amazing professors out there. But our peer-reviewed publications that we've had on our methodology, on our data, on our trials have had co-authors from anywhere from Hopkins to Harvard to UCLA and all the about. And so those are researchers who could never pull off such a crowdsourced study operationally from within their university, but they kind of join us as co-researchers on our projects. And so the short answer is it's been totally accepted. These are IRB approved studies. They meet these gold standards. And in many ways, we actually think that the data we're generating is more relevant and generalizable to what these products are actually going to do when you pull them off a shelf as a consumer and use them. And that's because when we're collecting that data from you, you're in the comfort of your own home using the product and telling me in that moment that I contact you how you feel. I'm not pulling you out of your natural environment, forcing you to go to a hospital where I then ask you how you feel. Of course, I'm stressed. I just went through traffic. I'm sitting here when I should be home with my family, And so I think this real world data, this naturalistic setting that we collect this makes the data that we have more generalizable. And it kind of is able to address a key criticism that we see, which is you have these very synthetic, artificial pharma trials, and then the product hits the real world. And why doesn't the real world data look at all like the trial data? Yeah. Well, it's because in the real world, things are messy. You skip doses. You're not in this perfectly controlled, sterile environment that they created. So that's if anything, that's why we actually think that our data is actually more useful to society than some of the kind of ways that traditional trials have been run.
And a lot of the outcomes you're looking at are also things which people want, people suffer from, and not just nebulous outcomes, things like quality of life, sleep, pain, anxiety. Now, looking at what you do in terms of you're testing these cannabinoids, and there's now, obviously this understanding that we have our own drug factory inside our bodies, the endocannabinoid system. We have these receptors and we produce cannabinoids as well. Mechanistically, how do you explain the link between how these exogenous, so these external cannabinoids that we take and ingest, what's the hypothesis as to how that works and produce this breadth of effects of symptom management, from reducing nausea to improving sleep to improving chronic pain and all of these various other things? How does that actually work scientifically?
Oh, it's a fascinating story. And so first, humans stumbled upon the cannabis plant, right? And its earliest recorded uses were probably utilitarian, hemp, rope, things like that. And then eventually they realized the intoxicating effects, then eventually the medical effects. And so we named these, as we started discovering these cannabinoids, we named them after the cannabis plant. And then it wasn't until the 90s that we discovered the receptors in our body that responded to THC. And so we named it endocannabinoid, our internal cannabis-like system. So it was only in the 90s that we realized that we had this system in our body. And at first we thought it was just located in the brain. Then we started finding this system on our organs, on our skin, in our bone, in our muscle, on our immune cells. And we're like, holy cow, this system is everywhere. And then we started looking at other species and animals to figure out who else had this. And then we're like, oh gosh, mammals have it and birds have it and all the reptiles have it. And we kept going further and further. Fish have it. And then we kind of realized that it evolved hundreds of millions of years ago. And wow, a vast majority of all higher order life on this planet has an endocannabinoid system. And yes, THC binds and stimulates the endocannabinoid system. CBD doesn't directly interact with the endocannabinoid system. It appears that CBD might be increasing levels of our own production of endocannabinoids. And then those endocannabinoids go and stimulate our endocannabinoid receptors. And if you are familiar with the effects of something like THC, it's no surprise that the endocannabinoid system is involved in sleep and pain and appetite regulation and all these things. But, on our immune cells, the endocannabinoid system is involved in the immune response, where generally, if the endocannabinoid receptors are stimulated, it actually reduces the activity of those immune cells. And that's why we see mostly in animal studies so far, these anti-inflammatory properties of cannabinoids. And so if you had to kind of summarize one description of our endocannabinoid system, scientists generally will say homeostasis, where the role of the endocannabinoid system, when you turn it on, is to bring things back to baseline. So you have a nerve cell, it's firing a lot because it's sensing pain. You turn on the endocannabinoid system, that firing goes down. Immune cell, overactive, inflammation, shooting, danger. Turn on the endocannabinoid system, inflammation goes down. Someone who has seizures, right? A really coordinated firing of neuronal activity, stimulate the endocannabinoid system, neuronal firing decreases. So
I see a lot of parallels between cannabinoids, the endocannabinoid system, and gut health, the microbiome, probiotics, in that historically, maybe 20, 30 years ago, they were both seen as hippie fringe science, and now they've both come into the mainstream. And there's also an appreciation that both have sound evidence base in that there is something here which is very important to our health. The gut microbiome and the microbiome in general is throughout our body, top to toe, from the skin microbiome to the vaginal microbiome to the gut microbiome. Cannabinoid system located everywhere in our body, like you've said, coordinates and influences our immune system, brain health, and beyond. And it has wide-reaching effects beyond its origin organ. So the endocannabinoid system goes beyond just the brain. The microbiome goes just beyond the gut. But then what happens is, now that there's an increasing understanding of the importance of this, it seems like pseudoscientists and charlatans have come out of the woodwork and are now capitalizing on this opportunity where the CBD and the cannabinoid system is taking its moment in the spotlight. And you see now there is an obscene amount of over-the-counter CBD products available out there. Everything from creams, pills, patches, vapes, to even CBD products for dogs. And I used to have a dog sitter who actually, without my knowledge, until I caught them doing it, was giving CBD oils to my dog to calm them down. Now, I think in the FDA and certainly in the UK, CBD products and supplements are promoted as supplements, and this is a highly unregulated industry. How safe and how effective are these over-the-counter supplements that people can buy in 2024?
Let's break it into, maybe let's talk about the safety first. And so earlier I alluded to that there is some concern as to potential side effects of CBD, but all the data we've seen is generally at pretty high doses. You're talking maybe starting at hundreds of milligrams a day consistently over time is when you tend to see certain things like you might see elevation of liver enzymes, which in a normal, healthy person may not be that concerning, but in someone who might be taking other medications that are already might be toxic to their liver, or someone who already has a liver issue or is predisposed to a liver issue, that can be something that's concerning, right? We also, speaking of drug interactions, CBD can boost the levels of other drugs. And so generally, if you're on a drug that warns against grapefruit consumption, that's a pretty good sign, because CBD also, kind of like grapefruit, interacts in a similar way with other drugs. So if you have a drug that says don't take this with grapefruits, probably stay away from CBD. It's going to interact with that drug and elevate levels of that other drug, which means those levels could hit toxic levels or have side effects from that. And also, we're not too sure what CBD does in pregnancy. So if you're about to get pregnant, if you're trying to get pregnant, or if you are pregnant, or even if you're breastfeeding, maybe stay away from CBD or cannabinoids in general, because those cannabinoids, they're fat soluble. They go right they can get through the milk to your baby when you're nursing, or if you're pregnant, those cannabinoids can be active, and they can, interact. And even though they're stimulating the endocannabinoid system in a fetus that's still growing, you may not want those signals bouncing around, because the fetus is using those signals to develop properly. So that's kind of on the safety side. Now, on the effectiveness side, one thing that I suspect is that a lot of these products are probably at doses that are too low to be significantly effective. And if you look at the high quality data on CBD, that shows effectiveness for something like seizures, or for something like, CBD at the right dose can be an antipsychotic that can help like schizophrenics. Wow. And at the right dose, it can be an anti-addictive agent that can lower cravings for other addictive substances like opioids or like nicotine and stuff like that. But those doses were all in the high hundreds of milligrams a day, sometimes exceeding 1,000 milligrams a day. And if you look at your average CBD product, I often see products that are dosed at 25 milligrams per capsule or per gummy, maybe 30, maybe 40 sometimes. So I think from a dosing standpoint, we probably need significantly a higher dose to start seeing effectiveness. And as a society, we still need more research to figure out. Another thing I forgot to mention, there's data on CBD as an anti-anxiety agent, but again, at hundreds of milligrams a day. We're still not too sure about what CBD could do for pain, for example, or for sleep. That data still, high quality trials, you still need to be published to really understand that piece. But it's clearly a dosing thing. And one more thing I'll say, it's an absorption thing as well. So cannabinoids in general, including CBD, they're pretty poorly absorbed. And in fact, best estimates are single-digit percentages of what you actually consume actually make it into your body. So, if you're taking 25 milligrams of CBD and in a form that's not optimized for absorption, then you're only getting like 5% of that, 6%, 8% of that into your body. So things that can increase absorption include taking it with fats. So you may often see people say, if you're going to take CBD, take it with a meal. Or that's why it's very commonly you'll see people sell CBD products where the product is dissolved in like coconut oil or MCT oil, olive oil, to help with that absorption.
Now, given the range of these over-the-counter products in various forms, you mentioned there that we're also testing and trying to figure out the optimum delivery route. Have we figured out what that optimal delivery route is? Because if people are going out and buying random supplements over the counter, and it's in vape form, it's in patches, it's in creams and topical ointments, how do people even know if that even gets absorbed, let alone being the most optimum delivery route?
It's tough. Yeah. I mean, speaking of optimal delivery, with the current state of science, the most optimal form you could say is, CBD dissolved in a fat or with the fat is to our best guess the optimal route.
So oral ingestion.
Oral ingestion. Yeah. I wouldn't really recommend smoking CBD. Also, I'm just vaping stuff in general. It's still a little exactly. Suspect. Yeah. Absolutely. Especially at least with nicotine, there's some decent oversight. But when it comes to like CBD vapes and stuff, I don't know what carrier agent they're putting in there. And we had the whole vape scare in the US where a lot of people were getting sick from cannabis vapes. And it wasn't even the CBD itself. It was that carrier agent that people were putting to actually be able to be vaporized. Like, they were not using an agent that should ever go in people's lungs. Sublingual is another route that people talk about, where when you go sublingual, you don't have to worry about swallowing it, getting absorbed into your intestine, making it through your liver to get into your bloodstream. And so, you could theoretically, perhaps the best actually is to take CBD, say in an oil form, put it under your tongue, let it sit for a bit, and then swallow. So you'll absorb some through your tongue, then you'll swallow the rest. And because it's sitting in that oil form, it might be absorbed better with that. There's also people that are packaging CBD into like these nanoparticles. You'll hear that word, nanoparticles, liposomal things. I haven't seen a ton of human data as to just how much that enhances the absorption. And then there's some people who still want to better understand the long-term impacts of these liposomes, of these nanoparticles. And sometimes they're so optimized and small that they actually can deliver these molecules to parts of the body that you may not want to deliver stuff to. Now, topically on the skin, that's interesting. There's actually data for the usage of cannabinoids, in particular CBD, for topical applications. Okay. Like we said, the endocannabinoid system is present in the skin. So there's been some decent data that it can help people who have maybe inflamed skin conditions.
Interesting.
But when you buy these topical products, the concentration of CBD can vary so wildly. Because even if you go, oh, this thing has 500 milligrams of CBD, well, is the jar this big? Is the jar this big? And therefore, if you scoop a bit and put it on, so that's a bit hard. That's tough. Yeah. And then there's people who sell cannabinoid products, including CBD products, aimed at addressing like muscle issues, right? Not the skin stuff. And that's where the data it's a little weaker, a lot weaker actually. And also like cannabinoids, it's hard for them to penetrate the skin to get to the muscle below. So that thing's got to be formulated properly to be able to get below the skin. If they're just taking CBD and combining it with whatever, coconut oil, I don't think that's penetrating the skin. So for muscle, tendon, ligament, inflammation, pain, I don't know if it's going to make it there. For skin stuff, yeah, sure. I think there's a much more plausible benefit with that.
So we know that the endocannabinoid system and CBD potentially could modulate a number of things from inflamed skin conditions to brain, anxiety, addiction, pain, sleep. There's a number of things which are amazing, are music to people's ears, because a lot of people suffer from this and are reliant on opioids and other chronic medication, which are expensive if you're in a non-public healthcare system. And basically, it's just a pain to be taking these medications. So if CBD is proven effective, it could be a game changer for a number of things. But unfortunately, given the regulation issues and the lack of optimal testing on dosing and delivery route, certainly for these over-the-counter products, it's probably at this point more hype than health. But right now, the most sort of rigorous data that we have for CBD still seems to be in rare epileptic and childhood seizure disorders. And maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, some post-chemo nausea and vomiting, potentially there's some good evidence there as well. What are the really, really strong evidence, which is almost unquestionable, do we have now for CBD in clinical settings?
Yeah, for CBD, I would say it's right now, it's still really just these rare forms of epilepsy. That's where we have good data, replicated data, multiple studies showing that benefit. And again, it's even kind of authorized as a prescription drug. Epidiolex, it was actually a UK company, GW Pharmaceuticals, that invented that. Recently also approved now in the US and other places around the world. Unfortunately, that's kind of the limit of that thread. It's these rare forms of mostly pediatric epilepsy and other neurologic issues, tubular sclerosis. But again, these pretty rare forms of epilepsy or kind of neurologic disorders. What you just described there, that's actually more on the THC side. So on the THC side, the kind of irrefutable high quality data is again, people who are losing a lot of weight, and most of the data is around people who have HIV/AIDS, and then the nausea and vomiting that you see with cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy. So that's kind of like the highest grade evidence for those two areas. And again, you're right that the whole world of cannabinoids, it's really interesting. And let's not forget all these other cannabinoids tucked away in this plant that were like, again, CBN for sleep. It was a multi-thousand person study that was done showing that it did indeed improve sleep outcomes that my company, Radicle Science, did. And you can find that it's published and all of that. But what about these other 100+ other cannabinoids? Really look forward to society increasing understanding awareness of it. But it's tough. All the years it's been locked away, all the years of the stigma of cannabis. A lot of these compounds still are gray regulatorily. Like, is this a legal compound or not? Is this a narcotic? It's not really intoxicating, but it does come from the cannabis plant. And so it's unfortunate that the policy and political elements of all of this have really hampered science for so long. And so I look forward to, with increased funding and more liberal access to these compounds, what that science could show.
I feel like the limitations on the research with regards to the vast number of cannabinoids beyond CBD and THC seems to be almost akin to saying, you can have oranges, but you can't have orange juice. It's like there's a number of things and, you can have that, but you can't have what it constitutes. But, based on the Radicle Science evidence that you've gathered over the last few years with patient data and all the interesting evolving science you've got about CBD, how can someone use information that you've gathered in your research to then make, rational choices and evidence-based choices if they were hell-bent on buying some CBD products? Now, as a doctor in the UK, I'm certainly not promoting someone buy CBD products, but there'll be a small minority of people, or even a larger chunk of people out there who are treatment resistant for a number of things, right. Chronic pain being one. I see a lot of patients in clinic, in the hospital with chronic pain, and they're on a number of various neurologic medication and chronic pain medication, and it still doesn't work. And these are the people who may be tempted to go the alternative route and seek things which are off license. Now, for someone who is hell-bent on doing that, how can they now use your data to make good judgment calls?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing I'll say is CBD cannabinoids, they are a small minority of all of the botanicals and herbs and natural products that we've studied at Radicle Science. And so what I'm about to say from a high level advice standpoint, a small amount of it comes from the data that we've actually generated, but much of it is just more all the other clinical literature out there, my experience when I was running UCLA's Cannabis Research Center and all the kind of public information and data out there. So, as well as just some pragmatic understanding of like how the industry is. So if you're someone who is trying to figure out how to use a CBD product, the first thing I might say is consider looking for a product that's otherwise known as full spectrum. This is a term you'll use. And the full spectrum product means it has a little bit of THC in there, but at least a legal permissible amount. Because hemp is the cannabis plant, hemp is just cannabis that has low THC. But a full spectrum product will have some THC in there. And hopefully it's an amount that is not intoxicating, but that way you're also maybe getting some of the benefits of THC as well as some of the benefits of synergy between THC and CBD, this entourage effect that you hear about. So maybe look for a full spectrum product. Now, if you're in a position in life where maybe you get drug tested, and if you fail for THC, it could have some catastrophic consequences. Next, I would say look for a broad spectrum CBD product, which means it's got CBD, it's got all the other stuff you might find in that hemp plant, but the THC has been filtered out. But it may have some CBN that we were talking about earlier. It may have some of these other phytocannabinoids, and that way, again, you're getting the benefit of all of these things. And so that way, I think, given that the data on pure CBD itself is still pretty narrow and limited to what we talked about, looking for broad or even full spectrum products gives you a better shot of being able to leverage all the other beneficial compounds and the evidence behind them in your product. The other thing I'll say is because, again, it tends to be a bit of an under-regulated market, you can't just be like, oh, this product says it has CBD, I'm going to buy it. The brand is everything. So do your research on the brand. How long has the company been around? Do they have a website that shows their COAs, their certificate of analyses? Do they put their team on there? If all that tends to be hidden and you can't find any record that this company has existed for more than 30 days, maybe it's a little concerning. So read about the company, read about the brand. And also, if you're going to buy CBD, there is a benefit to shopping from a reputable retailer. Because that retailer generally, they don't always, but generally they do some amount of diligence before they put a product on their shelf, making sure the company is actually incorporated properly or that they have some sort of manufacturing quality standards, things like that. Other things that you can look for, I don't know if they exist in the UK, but at least in the US, there are third body entities like the Clean Label Project, USP, and NSF. And they're third-party accreditation companies that mean this product has been manufactured with a consistent quality process in place. It's not really saying anything about the effectiveness or that even that the dosage is right. All it's saying is that this product is likely to contain the CBD it says it contains and is unlikely to contain lots of poisons and contaminants. Again, I don't know if there's analogous bodies in the UK that do that type of accreditation. And then in terms of dosing, I would say start at a low dose. The adage is start low and go slow. Start at a low dose, but increase, and see that you may need to get to starting to approach maybe 100 milligrams, maybe pushing well beyond that and start looking for those effects and then making sure you're not having any side effects. I know we talked about serious side effects like drug interactions, unknown interactions with pregnancy, as well as maybe elevating and potential toxicity to liver at high doses. But then there's other side effects that just not make you feel great. Some people have upset stomach. Some people get a little sleepy and lethargic. And so those are things to look out for as well.
So it'd probably be worthwhile, given the potential fact that CBD products and CBD chemicals can induce liver enzymes, make them more active and more present in the blood and cause that drug interaction and possible effect on the liver enzymes. It's maybe, if you're starting on something like that, to be, number one, telling your doctor so they can keep an eye out for potential side effects from the increased side effect profile, but also maybe thinking about getting blood tests on some sort of semi-regular basis so you can track any derangement yourself.
That is 100% it. And or even if you've just had a recent round of blood testing and blood work and you have normal enzymes, at least you are more assured that you're not one of those populations that may be especially vulnerable to some of the potential theoretical liver impacts of CBD. If you have no blood work at all, might as well get a first round just to know what your baseline is. And then, as you start over time, maybe every few months or even just at some point get another check. And so I knew what my baseline was before I started using it. That's important. If you just start using it and you don't have any recent blood work, and then you get around to blood work and you have maybe a little bit of abnormal liver, is that due to the CBD? Is that just your baseline? Is there other things you're doing? So it's important to maybe get that data point right before you start as well. And also in general, I think a lot of people start taking products, all sorts of health interventions, and they weren't really reflecting on where they were at before. And so now a month goes by, the bottle's empty, and they're like, oh shoot, I wasn't really paying attention to how many hours I was sleeping or the severity. So maybe before you start, just take a second, check in, be like, what's the severity of my anxiety right now? How many hours am I sleeping? How many times am I waking up? Whatever condition you're using it for, have a little bit of presence and intention about it. And then check in once a week, be a little methodical. And that way it's the best way for you to really feel and understand your unique body and have the best sense as possible as to what is this product doing for you so that you can know once you're through that first bottle, is it worth continuing or not?
So how far away do you think we are from high-level, qualitative, consumer-grade, over-the-counter CBD supplements?
I think the difficulty is that those product companies need to be guided by the broader clinical research or engaging in their own clinical research. And because of how funky the regulations have been, this industry, unfortunately, has been very hamstrung. And so, for instance, in the US, you can't buy CBD products at major retailers because the FDA is waving their finger, not saying that CBD is a dangerous narcotic. They're saying CBD is a pharma drug because this pharma company produced it for kids with seizures. It should never be sold as a natural product ever again. It's a pharma drug. And so those companies struggle to raise money. They struggle to generate sales. They struggle to then invest that in research and make better products. So at least here, it's kind of stuck in that gray zone. And then what you're left with is more academic research and maybe government funding for this type of stuff, which just takes a really, really, really long time. So I think we're still unfortunately, many years away before there's the next kind of wave of data and research that can inform either that or the regulations change and this industry is allowed to flourish and grow and really have the sales and the investment and the to actually conduct their own studies.
So you think it's because of the lack of ability to really monetize from a CBD supplement point of view, which is why these pharma companies haven't really taken it by its collar and accelerated research and production of this sort of thing, and it's been left to the fringes and the academics to look at the science and try to raise funding and raise the quality of research around CBD.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a microscopic analogy of like how this kind of happens broadly with all naturally occurring compounds. If I'm a pharma company, I'm not going to invest the $1 billion I need to bring a drug to market on something that by definition is naturally occurring and I cannot patent and anyone can just start selling willy-nilly. I want to create a synthetic analog. I want to have a ton of intellectual property and patents around this. And so that's kind of, nearly half of all of the FDA approved drugs we have here in the US were first discovered in plants. But what did pharma do? They first discovered in plants, like, I can't patent this. I'm going to recreate a synthetic version, generally from using synthetic organic chemistry from building blocks, and and I need to sometimes modify it slightly. So it's like, there's like a kink here. So this is not the naturally occurring version. I can patent and own this. And the second this shows up anywhere in the world, I can just like sue that company into submission. That's my molecule. Now I'm willing to invest $1 billion to bring this to market. And so I think the opportunity we have here is, especially now that we can run crowdsourced trials, especially now that everyone has a supercomputer in the palm of their hand, is we can, for pennies on the dollar, run rigorous science on these natural compounds, figure out what they do, and each natural compound where we have proof and evidence, in my opinion, that's a democratized medicine. And it'll never be expensive. No one can ever take it away. And a consumer can just go to the grocery store, buy it, and know how to use it. But that's why we need to get that knowledge out there. And that knowledge is what's been missing for so long.
Now, another naturalistic medicine, lion's mane. You have seen it everywhere on social media. People showing the purported benefits of lion's mane in neurogenesis, increasing cognitive function, helping to delay the onset of Alzheimer's, and all sorts of big and bold claims. And that's something at Radicle Science, you've also studied lion's mane. What is the evidence that we have right now, and how clinically translatable is the evidence behind supplementing with lion's mane?
Sure. And our lion's mane studies are still underway. But again, so everything I'll be speaking is just generally about the clinical literature. So I think people got really excited about lion's mane because there were some really promising non-human studies, so-called preclinical studies, cell and animal studies showing really interesting benefits for neuroprotective effects and things like that. And then they started looking at the human data, and most of the human data we have on lion's mane is done on older adults who are, you're right, already maybe starting to head towards mild cognitive impairment. You can also sometimes call that like dementia, and showing that it was able to actually preserve their cognitive function and not just preserve it, but in some cases even improve it. And what there hasn't been data on is for folks like you or I, or a lot of the folks who are taking lion's mane, where our cognition's already kind of normal. And is there that ability to go beyond that aspect? And also keep in mind, cognition can be impaired for various reasons. In older adults, it might be a very different reason than someone who's young and has cognitive impairment because they have like an underlying issue with like depression, or they had some, really bad brain inflammation from something that's happening. So I think, tons of promise of lion's mane. And I'm really excited for more data to come out as to how it could help people, again, like you or I, who don't necessarily suffer from any significant cognitive deficits. Could it help us go beyond? Or people who do have cognitive deficits, but they're not this older population. Could those people benefit as well from it?
I think just in terms of the space we're in with CBD, it's an evolving space, obviously, and you're doing a lot of research and gathering a lot of data at Radicle Science, which will hopefully add to the body of and the weight of the research we have to really shift forward the agenda on CBD and just various other substances, active ingredients that we found in marijuana, and I guess separate and dissociate the stigma from the medical benefits, which is ideally what we want to do. And that's, again, been lacking in various other agents in the past, things like psilocybin and NSD. It's always been wrapped up in some sort of stigma about, people being drug addicts and various other sort of negative connotations. But actually, there is some significant potential major benefits here, which could decrease the public's reliance on these chronic addictive opioid medication, improve people's treatment options with depression or eating disorders or various other things. So, thank you for what you're doing at Radicle Science, and thank you for joining me today. I think it's really shed a light on CBD, and hopefully someone can be a lot more informed about CBD supplements if they're going and buying something. And hopefully I want to get you on again for more updates on the research you guys are doing as well. Thank you, Jeff.
Sure. Yeah. And thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for everything you do to educate consumers on all things that can be beneficial to their health. So I appreciate it, Karan.
That was Dr. Jeff Chen separating the health from the hype about CBD. Now, next episode, we are going to be meeting Dr. Karan Tang. She's a friend of mine, also an experienced gynecologist, and we're going to be chatting about the one condition, well, one of many, that the medical field is pretty bad at diagnosing: endometriosis. This and a lot more about women's chronic health conditions. So subscribe so you don't miss that and the weekly Dr. Karan Explores podcast. And I'll love and leave you curious folks until next week.